In 2025, Iran once again shocked the United States, with a series of coordinated attacks, cyber warfare and regional escalations that blindsided even US military planners. But this isn't new. Iran has shocked America like this before, 4 times that changed the global order. Tonight, we're not just looking at headlines, we're going deeper, into the moments of geopolitical shock that have defined the volatile relationship between Washington and Tehran. These aren't just historical footnotes, they are the building blocks of the crisis we see unfolding today, a crisis that has pushed 2 nations to the brink. Each event was a calculated move, a signal of intent that America, at the time, either underestimated or misunderstood. From the streets of Tehran in 1979 to the battlefields of Iraq and the skies over Baghdad, Iran has consistently demonstrated its capacity to challenge American power in ways that defy conventional wisdom. The Shadow War, long fought through proxies and covert operations, has repeatedly broken into the open, each time leaving a scar on the American psyche and reshaping the strategic landscape of the Middle East. We'll dissect these 4 critical moments, including the fictionalized but plausible escalation of 2025, to understand the playbook Iran has used against a superpower. This is a story of defiance, of asymmetric warfare, and of a decades-long struggle for dominance that has now reached a terrifying new peak. Understanding these shocks isn't just about looking back, it's about seeing the pattern, understanding the motivations, and asking the urgent question, what comes next? For the first time in decades, Iran is confronting the US head-on, not through proxies, but through precision, direct force. The year 2025 began with a chilling silence, the kind that often precedes a storm. Intelligence agencies had noted increased chatter, but the scale and sophistication of what was to come were tragically misjudged. It started not with a bang but with a flicker, the lights going out across critical US infrastructure on the eastern seaboard. This was no ordinary power outage, it was a cyber offensive of unprecedented scale, targeting power grids, financial markets, and port authorities. As American officials scrambled to contain the digital chaos, the second wave of the attack began. In the Strait of Hormuz, a swarm of Iranian fast attack craft, supported by anti-ship missiles fired from hidden coastal batteries, overwhelmed a US naval convoy. It was a direct, audacious assault on American military might. The shock in Washington was palpable. For years, the operating assumption was that Iran would never risk a direct confrontation. Their strategy was one of proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq. These groups provided a layer of plausible deniability, allowing Tehran to bleed American interests without inviting massive retaliation. But the 2025 attacks shattered that assumption completely. This was a new Iran, or rather an Iran that had been hiding its true capabilities in plain sight. The cyber attacks demonstrated a level of technical prowess that had been severely underestimated. The coordination was flawless, suggesting years of planning and infiltration. It wasn't just about causing disruption, it was about demonstrating reach, proving that Iran could touch the American homeland in a meaningful, painful way. Simultaneously, the naval assault in the Hormuz was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Iran knew it couldn't match the US Navy carrier for carrier, ship for ship. So it didn't try. Instead, it used speed, numbers, and the element of surprise to create a localized superiority, targeting the vulnerabilities of a larger, more technologically advanced but less nimble force. The images of burning vessels sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. The regional escalation was the third prong of the attack. Within hours of the events in Hormuz, Iranian-backed militias across Iraq and Syria launched coordinated rocket and drone attacks on every US base in the region. It was a strategic effort to fix American forces in place, to prevent them from responding effectively to the main event in the Persian Gulf, and to sow chaos across the entire theater of operations. This wasn't just a military operation, it was a profound psychological one. The message from Tehran was clear: the old rules are over, the shadow war is over. We are no longer content to fight you through intermediaries. We will meet you directly, on a battlefield of our choosing, and we will make you bleed. The confidence, the sheer audacity of it, was what truly blindsided US military planners. They had war-gamed countless scenarios, but most involved an Iranian response to a US or Israeli first strike. Few, if any, predicted a proactive, multi-domain, coordinated first strike by Iran itself. It was a failure of imagination, a failure to understand how Iran's strategic thinking had evolved under years of crippling sanctions and covert pressure. The sanctions, intended to cripple and contain Iran, had instead created a pressure cooker. The Iranian leadership, feeling cornered, decided that the only way to break the stranglehold was through a dramatic, high-risk escalation. They calculated that the potential rewards, shattering the aura of American invincibility and forcing a new strategic reality, outweighed the immense risks of retaliation. The attacks were designed to exploit American political divisions and a perceived weariness with foreign entanglements. Tehran gambled that the American public, after decades of war in the Middle East, would have little appetite for another major conflict, especially one that began with such a stunning and humiliating blow to U.S. prestige and power. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of crisis meetings in the White House, frantic diplomacy, and a global economy teetering on the brink as oil prices skyrocketed. The world held its breath, watching to see how the wounded superpower would respond. Would it be all-out war, a limited retaliatory strike, or something else entirely? This fictionalized 2025 scenario serves as a stark warning. It illustrates how a long-simmering conflict, fought in the shadows, can erupt into open warfare with breathtaking speed. It shows that the assumptions of yesterday are not guaranteed to hold true tomorrow. And it sets the stage for understanding the historical shocks that made such a scenario not just plausible, but perhaps inevitable. The shock of 2025 wasn't born in a vacuum. It was the culmination of decades of animosity, a series of escalations where Iran tested the limits, pushed the boundaries, and learned from each encounter. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to the beginning, to the moment the old order was shattered and a new defiant Iran was born. This moment defined the Islamic Republic's defiance and America's limits. To understand 2025, you must first understand 1979. It was a year that redrew the map of the Middle East. The Iranian Revolution wasn't just a domestic upheaval, it was a seismic event that sent geopolitical tremors across the globe. And at its epicenter was the American embassy in Tehran, a symbol of a partnership that had curdled into deep-seated resentment. For decades, the United States had been the staunchest ally of the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. To Washington, he was a pillar of stability in a volatile region, a bulwark against Soviet influence. But to millions of Iranians, he was a corrupt, brutal dictator, a puppet of American interests who suppressed dissent with his feared secret police, the Savak. The resentment simmered for years, then boiled over into revolution. When the Shah, now deposed and dying of cancer, was admitted to the United States for medical treatment in October 1979, it was the final spark. For the revolutionaries in Iran, this was the ultimate betrayal. They saw it as a prelude to another CIA-backed coup, like the one in 1953, that had overthrown a democratically elected prime minister and reinstalled the Shah. They were determined not to let history repeat itself. On November 4, 1979, a group of radical Islamist students, followers of the revolution's leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, stormed the U.S. Embassy. They overwhelmed the small contingent of Marine Guards, seized the compound, and took 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. What began as a protest quickly morphed into an international crisis that would define U.S.-Iran relations for generations. The shock in America was profound. The idea that a group of students could overrun a U.S. embassy and hold Americans captive with the blessing of the new government was unthinkable. Night after night, the news was dominated by images of angry crowds chanting "Death to America" outside the embassy walls, and blindfolded Americans being paraded before cameras. America felt humiliated, impotent. President Jimmy Carter's administration was paralyzed. Diplomatic channels were useless, economic sanctions were imposed, but had little immediate effect. The crisis consumed Carter's presidency, contributing to a sense of national malaise and weakness. America, the global superpower, seemed powerless to free its own citizens from the grasp of a nascent revolutionary regime. The hostage-takers, with Khomeini's backing, made their demands clear. The U.S. must extradite the Shah to face trial in Iran, return the wealth he had allegedly stolen, and apologize for decades of interference in Iranian affairs. For the U.S., these demands were impossible to meet. The standoff hardened, dragging on for month after agonizing month. This wasn't just a diplomatic dispute. It was a clash of civilizations, a televised spectacle of defiance. The new Islamic Republic was using the hostages to forge its national identity, casting itself as the righteous David standing up to the arrogant American Goliath. Every day the crisis continued was a victory for Khomeini, solidifying his power at home and broadcasting his anti-imperialist message to the world. In April 1980, with diplomacy at a dead end, President Carter authorized a daring but incredibly risky military rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw. It was a catastrophic failure. A sandstorm, mechanical problems, and a tragic collision between a helicopter and a transport plane in the Iranian desert left 8 American servicemen dead. The mission was aborted, and the wreckage was left behind as another symbol of American humiliation. The failure of Operation Eagle Claw was another profound shock. It underscored America's limitations and seemed to confirm the narrative that a higher power was protecting the Iranian Revolution. For the Iranians, it was divine intervention. For America, it was a dark moment of military and strategic failure, compounding the political crisis. the hostages were finally released on January 20, 1981, after 444 days in captivity. Their freedom was secured not by military might but by painstaking, complex diplomacy mediated by Algeria. They were let go just moments after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president, a final calculated insult to Jimmy Carter. The crisis left an indelible scar. It severed diplomatic relations between the two countries, a break that persists to this day. It fueled a deep-seated mistrust and animosity in Washington that views Iran not as a normal nation-state but as a rogue revolutionary actor. It created an entire generation of American policymakers for whom Iran is the ultimate adversary. More importantly, it taught Iran a powerful lesson. Confronting the United States, even in the most audacious way, could pay dividends. It solidified the revolution, unified the country against a common enemy, and established the Islamic Republic as a major force on the world stage. It was the first great shock, the original sin from which all subsequent conflicts have grown. It was the birth of the playbook of defiance. America fought Iraq, but Iran was controlling the bleeding. After the September 11th attacks, the United States embarked on a mission to remake the Middle East. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was the centerpiece of this strategy. The goal was to topple Saddam Hussein, eliminate his non-existent weapons of mass destruction, and plant a beacon of democracy in the heart of the Arab world. But in solving one problem, America inadvertently created a golden opportunity for its other arch-nemesis, Iran. The shock here wasn't a single televised event like the hostage crisis. It was a slow, grinding realization that unfolded over years in the dusty streets and bloody battlefields of Iraq. The United States had won the conventional war in a matter of weeks, but it was completely unprepared for the insurgency that followed. And pulling the strings of the deadliest parts of that insurgency was Iran's Quds Force, led by the shadowy and honestly brilliant strategist Qasem Soleimani. Iran's strategy was brutally effective and deeply cynical. On one hand, Tehran officially cooperated with the new Iraqi government, which was dominated by Shia political parties that had long-standing ties to Iran. They played the political game, embedding their influence deep within the new Iraqi state. But on the other hand, they waged a vicious proxy war against the American forces who had put that government in power. This was the masterstroke of Iran's asymmetric strategy. They armed, trained, and funded a host of Shia militias. These groups were presented as Iraqi patriots fighting an occupation, but their marching orders, their most sophisticated weapons, and their funding came directly from Tehran. It was a classic case of plausible deniability, but on the ground, the evidence was overwhelming. The most lethal weapon in this proxy war was the Explosively Formed Penetrator, or EFP. These were sophisticated roadside bombs capable of piercing the heavy armor of American military vehicles. Unlike crude IEDs, EFPs required advanced manufacturing and technical expertise. U.S. intelligence traced their origin directly back to Iran's Quds Force. Each EFP that killed an American soldier was a message from Tehran. The shock for the U.S. military was twofold. First, the sheer effectiveness of these Iranian-backed militias. They were well-organized, well-equipped, and relentless. They turned entire provinces into no-go zones, bleeding American forces and draining American resources and political will. The U.S. found itself fighting a multi-front insurgency, with Sunni extremists on one side and Iranian-backed Shia militias on the other. Second, the political hypocrisy was staggering. American diplomats were meeting with Iraqi politicians who were, in turn, taking direction from Tehran. U.S. soldiers were being killed by weapons supplied by the very same Iranian regime that was benefiting from the political order the U.S. was spending blood and treasure to uphold. It was a strategic nightmare. Qasem Soleimani became a legendary, almost mythical figure during this period. He moved freely throughout Iraq, coordinating his network of proxies, meeting with top Iraqi officials, and directing the campaign against American forces, all while remaining an elusive ghost to the U.S. military. He was, in effect, the shadow governor of Iraq, wielding more influence than any American general or diplomat. This proxy war fundamentally altered the outcome of the Iraq War. While the U.S. succeeded in removing Saddam Hussein, the ultimate strategic victor was Iran. Tehran saw its greatest regional rival eliminated, a friendly Shia government installed in Baghdad, and the American military bogged down in a costly and demoralizing quagmire. It was a geopolitical coup achieved at a fraction of the cost. For American policymakers and military leaders, this was a slow-motion shock. It was the dawning realization that they had been outmaneuvered. They had played chess while Iran was playing Go. The U.S. focused on the immediate, tactical fight against insurgents, while Iran focused on the long-term strategic goal of regional dominance. The experience in Iraq taught the US a painful lesson about the limits of conventional military power and the effectiveness of Iran's proxy warfare model. It demonstrated that Iran could inflict significant pain on the United States without ever engaging in direct state-on-state conflict. They had perfected the art of fighting in the gray zone. This shock wasn't about a single moment of humiliation, but about the cumulative weight of over 1,000 American deaths attributable to Iranian-backed forces. It was the shock of seeing a strategic victory turn into a strategic defeat, orchestrated by an adversary who never fired a single shot in their own name. The Iraq proxy war was the second evolution of Iran's playbook. They had moved from the direct defiance of the hostage crisis to a more sophisticated, patient, and deadly form of indirect warfare. This model would be replicated across the region, in Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. But the next shock would bring the two nations closer to direct confrontation than ever before. This was the closest Iran and the US came to open war, until 2025. By January 2020, the shadow war between the United States and Iran was boiling over. Tensions had been escalating for months under the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign. After the US withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, reimposed crippling sanctions and designated the entire Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization, the situation was, honestly, a powder keg. The spark came in late December 2019, when an Iranian-backed militia, Kataib Hezbollah, launched a rocket attack on an Iraqi base, killing an American contractor. The US retaliated with airstrikes on the militia's positions. In response, militia supporters, orchestrated by Iranian proxies, stormed the US embassy compound in Baghdad, in a scene chillingly reminiscent of Tehran in 1979. The line had been crossed. President Trump, determined not to have his own Benghazi or Tehran hostage crisis, made a decision that would shock the world. On January 3, 2020, a US drone strike hit a convoy leaving Baghdad International Airport. The target was Qasem Soleimani, the architect of Iran's regional strategy, the commander of the Quds Force, and the second most powerful man in Iran. He was killed instantly. The shock of Soleimani's assassination cannot be overstated. This was not a proxy. This was not a militia leader. This was the targeted killing of a top-ranking state official, a revered national hero in Iran, and the mastermind of its foreign policy for 2 decades. It was a decapitation strike, a direct and personal blow to the very heart of the Iranian regime. For Iran, this was an act of war. The country exploded in a national outpouring of grief and rage. Millions flooded the streets for his funeral procession, chanting for hard revenge. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, wept openly over his coffin and promised a military response. The world watched, honestly terrified that this was the beginning of a full-scale war in the Middle East. The question wasn't if Iran would retaliate, but how and when. Would they unleash their proxies, launch terror attacks, target US allies? For 5 days, the tension was unbearable. US forces across the region were on the highest possible alert, bracing for impact. The world waited for Iran's response. Then, in the early hours of January 8th, Iran delivered its answer. In an operation named Martyr Soleimani, the IRGC launched more than a dozen ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi bases housing US troops, Al-Assad Air Base and a base in Erbil. This was the third great shock. For the first time ever, the state of Iran had launched a direct, overt military strike against the United States. The missiles flew from Iranian soil, under the Iranian flag, targeting American soldiers. The plausible deniability of the proxy war was gone. This was state-on-state violence, a direct challenge that America had not seen from Iran in 40 years. For the soldiers on the ground at Al-Assad, it was a terrifying ordeal. They scrambled for bunkers as missile after missile slammed into the base, the explosions shaking the very ground. In the hours that followed, the world held its breath. Had any Americans been killed? If so, a massive US counterstrike was almost certain, potentially igniting the regional war everyone feared. Initial reports were chaotic. Then, slowly, the news trickled out. Miraculously, there were no US fatalities. Early warnings had allowed troops to take cover just in time. The lack of fatalities gave both sides an off-ramp. Iran, having launched a powerful and public retaliation to satisfy its domestic audience, signaled it had concluded its response. President Trump, able to claim victory because no Americans were killed, chose to respond with new economic sanctions rather than military force. The immediate crisis was de-escalated, but the shock lingered. It was later revealed that over 100 US service members had suffered traumatic brain injuries from the force of the missile blasts. The attack was far more precise and damaging than initially reported. Iran had demonstrated a startling capability with its ballistic missile program, hitting its targets with accuracy over hundreds of miles. This event was a paradigm shift. Iran proved it was willing and able to absorb the risk of a direct military confrontation. They had called America's bluff. They had attacked US forces directly and, in their view, gotten away with it. They had restored a form of deterrence, sending a clear message: if you kill one of ours, we will strike you back directly. The Soleimani crisis was a dress rehearsal for a larger conflict. It showed that the guardrails preventing open war were weaker than anyone thought. It normalized direct military strikes between the two nations, setting a dangerous new precedent. This was the final historical shock before the imagined crisis of 2025. It was the moment the shadow war truly broke into the light, with both sides trading direct, heavy blows. It proved that the long-feared war was not a distant possibility but a clear and present danger waiting only for the next miscalculation, the next assassination, the next attack. From the revolutionary fervor of 1979 to the proxy battlefields of Iraq, from the dramatic assassination of a top general to the imagined multi-front war of 2025, the story of US-Iran relations is a story of escalating shocks. Each event was a rung on a ladder, leading both nations higher and higher into a more dangerous and unstable reality. Iran has learned to weaponize surprise, to master asymmetric warfare, and to challenge a superpower in ways that really defy conventional military logic. America, in turn, has often been left reacting, caught off guard by a determined and resourceful adversary. The playbook has evolved, but the core objective remains the same. For Iran, it is about survival, defiance, and the expulsion of American power from its neighborhood. For the US, it has been about containment, pressure, and preventing a nuclear-armed Iran from dominating the Middle East. These competing visions have created a cycle of conflict that has now spanned more than 4 decades, with each side's actions reinforcing the other's worst fears. The trust is non-existent, the diplomatic channels are frozen, and the military options are always on the table. Now we stand at a precipice, looking into the abyss of what comes next. The fictionalized war of 2025 is a warning. A possible future built on the foundations of a very real and volatile past. The pattern of escalation is clear, and the potential for a catastrophic miscalculation is higher than ever. Is this the final showdown? Or just another chapter in a much larger war? The answer will define the future of the Middle East, and perhaps the world. Which moment shocked America the most? Is 2025 the beginning of something far bigger? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe for raw, real geopolitical breakdowns every week.